I'm Gareth Vaughan. I'm joined by David Skilling, who's the director at Landfall Strategy Group and former chief executive of public policy think tank, the New Zealand Institute. Welcome, David. Appreciate your time. Can we just kick off by, if I can just kick off by asking you where you are these days and how coronavirus is being dealt with or combated in the country you're in?
So we are about 2 months ahead of coronavirus. I was in Singapore up until around Christmas time, where we've been for the last 11 years since leaving New Zealand, and then made the move to the Netherlands, as I said, around Christmas time. So when we left Singapore, of course, coronavirus didn't exist. It arrived sort of towards the end of January or February, and coronavirus has since moved to Europe. So we've got a perspective both on Singapore, where it has been until recently fairly well under control, and moved to Europe, where over the last month or so, coronavirus has become, if you like, the global epicenter. With countries like France, Italy, and Spain, but also the Netherlands, being hit. So as of yesterday, there's about 2,000 people dead of coronavirus-related illnesses in the Netherlands, which is one of the higher numbers in Europe, and about 20,000 or so confirmed cases, although of course there'll be many more than that. And along with many other places in Europe, the Netherlands is under a state of partial lockdown, not as severe as in some other countries like France and the UK, or indeed New Zealand. So you can still get out and about, if you like, as long as you maintain a degree of social distancing. Shops are open, again with social distancing, but it's obviously a lot quieter and a bit of concern. So, Europe is, struggling, I guess. Although the good news over the last week or so is with these lockdown measures, it does feel like the curve has been stabilised. And numbers are trending down. And the conversation in places like Austria and Denmark and Norway is now very much, how can we transition, over time to a more sort of normal state of affairs and begin to remove some of these restrictions.
Yes, well, that sounds like some positive news, which is good at the moment. Look, obviously, there's still a lot of uncertainty around, though, I guess, in terms of how much longer coronavirus holds the world in its grip. Ultimately, how bad it gets. I mean, obviously, some countries, as you've noted, experiencing significant number of deaths, a lot of people getting ill, public health systems under a lot of pressure. But I guess probably primarily interested in talking to you about the economic side of things. Now, we're obviously seeing governments borrowing a lot of money and reserve banks ramping up their balance sheets, trying to breathe some life into financial markets and the financial system. What's your take on how governments and central banks are reacting so far?
Well, reasonably well. I mean, the big caveat, of course, is that these are national level responses almost entirely. So there's been no coordinated global response in the way that there was in the global financial crisis, and the G20 has been absent. The G7 is not doing anything. So this is, and the IMF are doing some things, but not on the scale that we saw sort of 10, 12 years ago. So, these are very much national level responses and regional in the case of Europe. And I would say for the most part, many governments have responded pretty well in a similar way to New Zealand. Various wage subsidy schemes, various ways to get financing into the real economy, particularly through SMEs and other firms. And these schemes have been designed quickly, reasonably large. Well designed. So New Zealand obviously went pretty early on these schemes, again, well designed. Singapore has done even more. Many European countries have got similar schemes in place. But these, I think, at best, and they are well designed, they are pretty big in the scheme of things, but they are, at best, a partial offset. I mean, the collapse in economic activity that we are seeing in Q1, in Q2, and then I think for the rest of 2020, even in reasonably optimistic scenarios, is unprecedented, at least for several decades. It will go beyond what we have seen in the global financial crisis. And so, this is going to be a body blow, if you like, to the global economy. And so, yes, governments are doing a good job. There's, I suspect, much more that will be to come. But this is a partial offset. It's not going to reverse or undo the impact. So, the forecasts that are coming out, even over the last few days, global recession through 2020, negative growth, and even during the global financial crisis, global GDP growth didn't go negative over the full year. The WTO came out yesterday with predictions ranging from about -13% to -32%, I think, in terms of world merchandise trade growth through 2020. Again, worse than we saw through the global financial crisis when I think it was -12%. So yes, governments are throwing, if you like, the kitchen sink at these things. They're doing what they can. And as I said, I think there'll be more to come as the severity and the scale of this becomes even more apparent. But you can't lock down entire economies, as many countries have done, without having a very severe effect. So, and this is going to take a while to undo. So even in sort of reasonably sort of positive scenarios where these lockdown measures are kind of curbing the growth and hopefully beginning to trend down over time, as we saw in Singapore, which looked like it was the gold standard for the first couple of months. They had 140, 150, I think, cases overnight, which is the highest daily increase they've had. And so they have moved to lockdown measures. And I think, listening to the Singapore PM and others, we should expect kind of flare-ups. Even if you think you've got it under control, it will come back. And so the ability to kind of declare success, if you like, and say, look, we're going to unwind these measures and kind of move back to normality, I think that's still quite some time ago. It will be a step-by-step measure, even in countries that look okay, like the Denmarks and Austrias. That's going to be a very gradual release. And I think the other concern is that it's been through East Asia, China, Taiwan, South Korea, and the like. Obviously, Europe and the US are in the firing line at the moment. But one part of the world where it really hasn't hit, at least not in the reported numbers, is the developed world. So Africa, Latin America, India, and the like. And obviously, these countries have much less robust, less well-resourced public health systems. And so from a global perspective, if the next wave is into emerging markets, that's a very large part, just from an economic perspective, it's a large part of a global economy that's affected. So this is not something that is kind of a V shape, right? It goes down sharply and then bounces back. In some countries, there might be an element of this, but I think for the most part, this is a very long, protracted way back. And so the challenge from a government policy perspective is for governments like New Zealand and others that have been very aggressive in the early days in terms of fiscal stimulus. That's kind of manageable if this is a short, sharp scenario and you want to kind of stabilize the ship for a discrete period of time. But if we are talking 9, 12, 18, 24 months before we return to economic normality, with the potential for flare-ups, that's a much more challenging scenario, particularly for an economy like New Zealand, who is, in very, very good fiscal shape because of decisions that have been made over the last sort of 10, 15 years and more. But it's very hard for the government to kind of stimulate an economy that's in cold storage for that length of time. So this is going to be deeply, deeply challenging, much more so than the global financial crisis.
You made a very good initial point there about the lack of global coordination on this. That's something I've thought quite a bit about. How big of a problem do you think that is?
Well, obviously these things, both from a public health perspective and also from an economic perspective, are much better if they are done in a coordinated way. And the early days, at least, of the global financial crisis, where Gordon Brown was UK Prime Minister and leading the charge along with the US, that worked pretty well in terms of getting these measures agreed and kind of laid out in a kind of coordinated way. And obviously China played an important role in that as well. I mean, the blunt reality is there is no chance at all of seeing anything similar to that. The US and China are at loggerheads. The US and Europe are at loggerheads. President Trump has absolutely no interest in doing anything multilateral. And even within Europe, as I'm sure you're aware, they are arguing about how to kind of allocate risks and allocate kind of sort of debt guarantees and the like across the region. So the reality is, to an extent, it's every country for themselves. And yes, there are measures or attempts being made to ensure that supply chains keep moving and that medical supplies can move across borders, and that's good to see. But I think the reality is that in the current geopolitical environment, we're not going to see anything coordinated. So, that is a problem, and it is going to reduce the effectiveness of these individual measures. And I think will become, frankly, more important over time because, if you think about the challenge of reducing these restrictions, these public health restrictions on movement, on cross-border flows and the like, almost by definition, you can't make those decisions in isolation. I mean, it's easy enough to kind of close your borders down. But if you want to reopen, you have to have a degree of assurance in terms of what controls and tests and the like are being done in the other country. If Austria begins to open up its borders, for example, it's very hard to do that unless you're in coordination with Germany and Italy and Switzerland and the like. So I think over the next period of time, as countries try to figure out how they kind of normalize to an extent and what that kind of gradual sort of process looks like, the absence of coordination, at least globally, is going to be challenging. Within Europe, it's easier to see how countries might coordinate on public health and kind of cross-border movements. But I think one thing, and again, this is relevant from a New Zealand perspective, the likelihood of return of international people movements, which affects obviously tourism and migration and the like. I think that's going to be very, very patchwork. And I think these political tensions between countries are going to make politicians and political systems kind of reluctant to open up early, and just it's going to be sort of practically difficult to do. So that the likelihood, for example, of significant US-China people flows, the resumption of flights between the US and China for some time is very, very limited. And I think that will make airlines reluctant to put on seat capacity. And so this coordination problem, I think, is less salient from a macroeconomic policy perspective, although it would clearly be nice to have. I think where it really bites is in terms of how we kind of stage and sequence the return to normality, the public health dimensions. I think that's where the absence of coordination becomes a really big deal.
You mentioned return to normality there. Is there going to be a new normality post COVID-19?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how big of a blow is this to globalization?
So, I mean, I should say return to normality kind of advisedly, because, normal has shifted on us. So there's no return to the status quo ante. We're not going back to, life in December 2019, where kind of things looked like they were kind of on the up. Gradually world trade was increasing, global GDP looked like it was heading in the right direction. That world is kind of far in the rear view mirror. I think in terms of, structural impact on globalization and the like, the way that I guess I think about the structural impact of coronavirus is that it accelerates and reinforces pre-existing trends. Clearly there were already significant tensions in the global system, the trade wars over the last couple of years just being one, but more broadly, the kind of the intersection of economics and politics, right? So technology wars, tariffs, restrictions on foreign ownership, particularly that relating to China. And so I think, this, given this politicization, sort of the resumption of kind of normality, resumption of people flows, trade flows, they're political decisions. And so I think globalization is going to have many more political frictions associated with it. I think that means, among other things, a much more kind of regional model. So kind of, an increasing amount of world trade and world investment being undertaken with a regional bias to it. So kind of Asia, Europe, the Americas, very broadly speaking. So, is globalization going to reverse? Well, I don't think it's going to reverse. Clearly, it's taking a big hit. The WTO numbers I mentioned a moment ago, it is going to be down for some time in quite significant measure. But I think it's more than reversing, it's changing shape, right? So more is being done domestically and regionally. The nature of those flows is shifting. Supply chains are being regionalized, if not kind of brought onshore fully. But it is going to be, the extent to which that happens is going to vary sector by sector. So, with complex supply chains and strategic goods, with technology, I think there is going to be increasing political oversight over how that happens, much greater focus on resilience of supply chains and the like. So there are certainly going to be some changes. And I think on dimensions like tourism, which is obviously a fairly big deal for New Zealand, it's going to be quite some time before we return to anything like what we have seen over the last several years. I think just people are going to be less reluctant to travel, particularly long distances. I think governments are going to own quite a few of the airlines in terms of seat capacity growth. I think that's going to be constrained over what we have seen over the last little while. So, will globalization reverse? No, but it's certainly going to be much dampened. It's certainly going to change in shape. And I think for a small economy like New Zealand that's reliant on trade from agricultural produce, technology, tourism, there are some challenges to overcome, and we need to think about how we position ourselves to make sure that we are able to compete in this new world. Tourism is not going to be the growth engine than it has been. Migration is going to be constrained, which is another dimension of globalization, and migration has been, again, a very important driver of New Zealand's labour force growth and our GDP growth over the last decade, and indeed beyond that. For other things like agriculture, Demand so far looks like it's holding up. They're not part of complex supply chains, but at the same time, we have pressures on the technology front. With people moving away from red meat and dairy to other substitutes. So this is challenging, and coronavirus, I think, just amplifies or reinforces some of those pressures that many New Zealand exporters were already under. So again, I think the issue for New Zealand, even as we contemplate sometime in the future about kind of releasing some of these restrictions, trying to move back to something that looks more like normal, that happens in a context where we're already confronting a range of challenges, some of which are actually quite substantial. So it is a challenging outlook, I think, for New Zealand.
You noted earlier that it's going to be a long run downturn as well. So I guess interested in what are the options for policymakers and governments to dig their countries out of this large hole that they're going to be in. I mean, are we looking at austerity? Are there alternative options? How do you see it?
Yeah, I mean, austerity is a somewhat charged word. I mean, the reality is that public debt loads and private debt loads as well, for that matter, are going to increase very significantly across the world. Some countries are better placed than others to do that. New Zealand's in a very good place, but even so, I haven't seen the formal predictions out of Treasury. But after the GFC, there were projections of net debt getting up to 80-90% of GDP from about zero. So you can expect multiple tens of percentage points of GDP kind of incremental to our net debt to GDP, which is significant and will take obviously a very long time to repay. Particularly in the context of a lower trend rate of GDP growth, and that's true around much of the developed world. Many of which already had very substantial debt loads because of the GFC, which hadn't been paid back. And so I think what we are likely to see, and again there was some movement in this direction prior to coronavirus, was you're going to see monetary policy and fiscal policy increasingly fused and integrated, where basically the central bank is printing money, it's buying up government debt. We see that in Europe already. The Fed is obviously moving in that direction also. And so what seemed like kind of fringe economic policy even a year ago, modern monetary theory and the like, and basically saying there are no budget constraints and central banks can just buy up government paper. I think we are sort of de facto moving in that direction anyway. So, so we are moving into uncharted territory. Where are the binding budget constraints on governments? How much debt can you issue? Can central banks keep on buying this government paper with no adverse consequences in terms of inflation? Obviously the immediate issue is a huge deflationary shock. But can you keep doing this without any of the kind of risks and negative consequences that people are concerned about? So, will there be austerity? I mean, I think, the reality is the productive potential of all economies has reduced significantly and will remain lower than where it was in December for quite some time. So people's incomes are going down. Governments, even if they put the foot on the accelerator in terms of fiscal stimulus, it's only a partial offset. And I think over the next period of time, constraints on their ability to even do that will emerge. I mean, even if you're the US, you can't borrow ad infinitum. There are some limits and some budget constraints. So, this is, we are moving, you use the word austerity, but I mean, the austerity is not simply the government's doing. I think the reality is living standards in an economic perspective have taken a hit. People's incomes are going to be lower. Unemployment is going to be, double digits, in some cases, 20% plus for some time. And so household balance sheets are going to be stretched. So we're moving into a much tougher financial situation. And at some point, I think governments, even with kind of this new normal, if you like, in terms of what they are prepared to do, are going to run into constraints. And I think just to finish that, for one analogy that I think about quite a lot is the 1970s, where again, there were a series of very significant demand and supply side shocks, from the oil price shocks, the US moving off a Bretton Woods exchange rate system and all of the volatility of moving to floating exchange rates, very significant macro imbalances, huge deficits in the US. And that ended up shortly thereafter in periods of stagflation, very high inflation, high unemployment, pretty ordinary rates of GDP growth. And kind of governments, because they had put too much weight on sort of fiscal stimulus, there were supply side constraints everywhere because of import substitution and tariffs and protectionism, ended up being a real mess. And I think The challenge for governments is how do you manage through the current situation, which is unprecedented. It is global. It is kind of not man-made, if you like. It's kind of an exogenous shock. How do you manage through that in a way that is that doesn't kind of create a mess like it did in the 1970s? And I think the message for New Zealand, where the 1970s weren't perhaps our finest moment in terms of import substitution, losses of taxpayer money on what turned out to be white elephants. I think the issue for New Zealand is let's be thoughtful about the way in which we marry the short-term imperative of keeping the economy afloat, getting money into people's pockets, in some cases, I'm sure, basically renationalising things like Air New Zealand. But how do we do that in a way that avoids some of the bad experiences of the 1970s, and with luck begins to think about investing in infrastructure and other things that actually positions us for kind of recapturing some economic value down the track. So this is a challenge that faces many governments, and I think as you can imagine, most governments are just busy on firefighting what is an absolutely unprecedented challenge. But at some point over the next period of months, there is going to have to be a conversation about how do we move from simply a kind of a firefighting short-term stimulus and actually think about how we structure this in an intelligent, thoughtful way that avoids some of these risks and actually positions our economy for strength down the track.
Well, look, thanks for that, David. That's David Skilling, Director at Landfall Strategy Group in the Netherlands. Appreciate your time.